Welcome to Econverse, a podcast that breaks down the biggest economic trends and current affairs shaping our world. In this podcast, we cut straight through the headlines to reveal the real impact of economic shifts on businesses, governments, and most importantly, on you. So get ready, tune in, and join us as we make sense of the economy, one episode at a time.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Econverse. And today we're diving deep into India's 2025 budget, which is making waves all over the place. So if you're interested in global economy, you definitely want to pay attention to this one.
Absolutely. Budgets are always a window into a country's economic priorities, right? And this one from India, it's pretty interesting.
We've got a whole bunch of articles here from sources like the Economic Times and the Indian Express. And the big story seems to be tax cuts. But as with any big economic policy shift, there are going to be some people celebrating and some feeling a little left out.
Right, like who wins, who loses. We'll get to that for sure, but first, let's zoom out and look at the overall picture.
Yeah, let's do that.
One thing that's really grabbing attention is the size of these tax cuts. I mean, India has just announced its biggest income tax reduction in a decade. It's a pretty big deal.
Huge. And it's not just a tiny little tweak either. We're talking about people earning up to 12 lakh, which is about $13,800. They're going to be paying zero income tax. Yeah. It's a pretty massive change for a whole lot of people. But there's got to be a catch, right?
Well, the catch is the government is taking a 1 trillion rupee hit in revenue by doing this.
Wow, that's a big gamble.
It is.
They're basically betting that this extra money in people's hands will lead to a surge in spending.
Exactly. And the hope is that the spending will then encourage businesses to invest and create new jobs.
Right. But the question is, will it be enough to really get the economy moving?
That's the big question, isn't it? India's growth has been a little bit sluggish lately, so there are a lot of hopes pinned on this budget to kind of shake things up and get things moving again. And this move with the tax cuts, it seems like it's a bet on boosting consumer demand.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Who are the big winners in all of this? It looks like the middle class is having a pretty good day. With this new tax setup and the standard deductions and all the focus on consumer spending, this budget is looking like a win for the average Indian taxpayer.
Yeah, definitely. All that extra money in people's pockets could lead to more savings and investments from the middle class, which down the line can help with long-term economic growth.
Exactly. Just to give you an idea, let's say someone's earning 2.5 million rupees. That's a pretty decent salary. They'd be saving something like 9,500 rupees every month. That's not chump change. They could put that into savings investments or just have more spending power.
For sure. It's about giving people the freedom to make choices that work for them financially. But it's not just about individual gains either. The government's also trying to boost specific sectors that fit into their vision for India's economic future.
Right. Let's talk about those sectors. Agriculture, which has always been a huge part of India's economy, is getting some extra love this time around. There's more support for farmers, including easier access to credit, and there's a new push to make India self-sufficient when it comes to growing pulses.
That's a strategic move. Makes sense. Strengthening the agricultural sector means more food security for the country, which is always important. And even more importantly, it creates jobs in rural areas, which helps with overall economic stability. And it's not just agriculture that's getting attention. Manufacturing is another big focus. There's a clear push to make India a global hub for making toys. And there's support specifically for small and medium-sized businesses, too.
Right, because those are the backbone of any economy.
Exactly. Nurturing those smaller businesses that are sometimes overlooked, it helps create a more dynamic and resilient economy. They're often the ones driving innovation, and they create a wide range of job opportunities.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about India's young people.
Yeah.
The budget includes a plan to increase the number of spots available in engineering and medical colleges, so more young people will have the chance to get a higher education. And there's a big push for investment in artificial intelligence centers of excellence, too.
Investing in education and cutting-edge tech like AI, that's essential for making sure the next generation has the skills they need to thrive in a global economy that's constantly changing. It sets India up to be a leader in these fields.
It's all about the future. And on top of all that, India's startup scene is getting a 100 billion rupee fund to help fuel even more innovation.
Wow, that's a serious commitment. Shows they're serious about making India a leader in technology and entrepreneurship, tapping into all that energy and innovation coming from the startup community.
So we've been talking about the sectors and the people who are likely to benefit from this budget, but we got to be real here. Not everyone's popping champagne corks.
True. With any budget, there are going to be some areas that feel like they were left out. Every choice means something else doesn't get chosen, and this budget definitely prioritizes certain things over others.
Right. Let's shift gears and talk about some of those areas that might be feeling a little disappointed.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, so first up, let's talk about the railways. There were a lot of people hoping to see some big investments in modernizing and expanding the railway system. But this budget doesn't really deliver on that front.
Yeah, it kind of feels like a missed opportunity to some, especially when you consider how important efficient transportation is for economic growth. But maybe this signals that the government's shifting its focus to other types of infrastructure development,
Yeah.
maybe prioritizing newer technologies or different ways of getting around.
Interesting. And the railways aren't the only ones feeling a bit let down. The defense sector is also expressing some disappointment. National security is obviously still a top priority, but the budget only includes a small increase in defense spending. Some people were expecting to see big modernization projects, and they're not getting that.
It seems like the government's putting more emphasis on stimulating economic growth through things like those income tax cuts, rather than pumping a ton of money into defense right now. It really shows how every budget is about making choices, focusing on some areas and maybe putting others on hold.
Right? Choices, trade-offs. It's always a balancing act.
Yeah.
Okay. So another group that's not exactly thrilled is India Inc. Big corporations were hoping for some sweet tax breaks or some policies that would make it easier to do business. But this budget doesn't really give them much.
It's almost like a deliberate move by the government to focus on individuals and smaller businesses instead of giving even more advantages to the big guys. It's a shift in emphasis for sure, putting more focus on a bottom-up approach to economic growth.
So it's more about empowering the little guy than giving the big guys even more.
Exactly. And then there's the infrastructure and construction sector. They're also facing some headwinds. The budget shows pretty limited growth in capital expenditure, and there are actually some cuts in planned spending. This is a tough pill to swallow for companies in those industries, especially the big players like Larsen and Toubro Siemens, Indian Railway Finance Corp.
Yeah, not good news for them. It seems like the government's taking a more cautious approach to infrastructure spending, maybe focusing on efficiency and really targeted investments instead of just pouring money into huge expansion projects.
It could be a way to make sure that every rupee is being used wisely and strategically, making sure it's having the biggest impact possible.
Makes sense. And then we have the oil and refining sector. They're not getting much relief either. The budget doesn't offer any help with those high costs. And it doesn't give any compensation to oil retailers who've been taking a hit by selling cooking gas below market prices.
This could be a sign that they're moving towards more market-driven pricing in the energy sector. The government might be trying to step back a little bit, reduce their intervention in those subsidies, and let market forces have more influence on prices.
So less government control, more letting the market do its thing.
Right. And finally, we can't forget about healthcare. This is another area where people are raising some eyebrows. Even though India spends less on healthcare compared to a lot of other countries, this budget doesn't introduce any major new programs or big increases in funding.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Yep.
Even if the budget does put some money into existing healthcare programs, the lack of any significant new investment, it does make you wonder about how committed the government is to really strengthening the public health system and making sure everyone has access to good quality healthcare, especially when you think about how big India's population is and all the health challenges they're facing.
It's definitely something to think about. So looking at the big picture, it's clear that this budget has its winners and losers. But beyond the specific sectors and policies, what can we learn about the government's overall economic strategy?
Yeah, let's zoom out and look at the big picture. What's the story here?
Well, one thing that really stands out is the emphasis on boosting domestic consumption as the main engine for economic growth. Those big income tax cuts we talked about earlier, that's a clear sign of that strategy. The idea is that by giving people more money to spend, you're going to increase demand, which should encourage businesses to invest, expand, create more jobs. It's all connected.
So it's like a chain reaction. More spending by individuals leads to more economic activity, which benefits everyone.
Exactly. And this approach is different from what we've seen in past budgets, which were more focused on attracting foreign investment and using infrastructure spending to drive growth. This shift towards domestic consumption, it suggests a deliberate move towards making India's economy more self-reliant and resilient, especially given all the uncertainty in the global economy right now.
It makes sense to focus on what you can control, especially when things are unpredictable out there in the world. But is focusing on domestic consumption enough to solve some of the deeper problems that India faces?
That's the key question. Critics argue that while boosting consumer spending might give the economy a shot in the arm in the short term, it's not going to be enough to tackle issues like underemployment, the lack of good quality jobs, persistent poverty. These are complicated problems that need a more comprehensive approach.
So it's not a magic bullet.
Right. And there are concerns that this budget doesn't really address crucial challenges like poverty, inequality, climate change in a meaningful way.
Even though there is some money set aside for social programs and environmental initiatives, some people say it's just not enough to really make a dent in those problems.
It's a valid point. I think it's too early to say for sure whether this budget is a success or a failure. Only time will tell what the real impact of these choices will be. But one thing's for sure, this budget represents a change in how India is thinking about its economy. It prioritizes domestic consumption, it targets specific sectors for growth, and it aims to create a more self-reliant path to development. It's a new direction.
A new chapter. So for our listeners who aren't in India, why should they care about this budget? What does it mean for the rest of the world?
India's economy is a big deal globally. What happens there affects everyone. It's a major player in international markets, and its economic decisions have ripple effects all over the place. If this focus on domestic consumption leads to a surge in India's economic growth, that could create all sorts of new opportunities for trade and investment for countries around the world.
But there's also the flip side, right?
Of course. If this strategy doesn't work and India's economy stays stuck in neutral, that could have a negative impact on the global economy too, potentially leading to slower growth and more instability.
So everyone's watching to see how this plays out. It's high stakes.
That's a wrap for this episode of Econverse. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening right now. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment on YouTube or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the world of economics.